I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandmother's lawyer had just told me, in the cold, echoing hall of her Manhattan office, that my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, had left me, her youngest granddaughter, and the one she had always spoiled, the entire $3 billion of her estate. Every other relative, cousins, uncles, even my parents, were completely cut out. I felt my hands shake, my chest tighten, and a shiver crawl up my spine as the words sank in. How could she possibly favor me over them? Over all the years of petty fights, stolen birthday presents, and whispered insults, why would she choose me alone? My name is Harper Liddell. I'm 29 years old. And until this moment, I thought my life was complicated but ordinary. I had a small apartment in Brooklyn, a job I tolerated, and a family that loved drama more than truth. But this revelation changed everything. Grandmother Eleanor had always been larger than life, a force that could silence a room without raising her voice, a woman whose opinions were law in our family. She was the kind of woman whose presence made strangers feel guilty for sitting too close, whose laughter could make even the coldest winters feel warm. Growing up, I had clung to her stories of Wall Street triumphs, luxurious European vacations, and secret family histories. I remembered the evenings in her penthouse, the scent of mahogany and jasmine mixing, as she recounted tales of betrayal and triumph. She had always favored subtle rebellion, the kind she saw in me when I refused to marry the boy she deemed suitable, or when I chased dreams instead of security. I had always suspected she understood me more than anyone else in the family, but $3 billion? That was a statement louder than words, louder than any scolding or praise I had ever received. I sat in that leather chair, staring at the thick envelope that contained the legal documents. My mind raced. How could this be real? The news of inheritance wasn't something whispered or hinted. It was the kind of revelation that could fracture families, rewrite alliances, and ignite grudges that lasted generations. I could hear the distant sounds of the city outside, the honking cars, the hurried footsteps, the life continuing in a rhythm I felt suddenly alien to. My parents had always called me the dreamer, the one who never settled, the one who looked at life sideways. They'd never approved of my choices, and now, with this unimaginable windfall, I realized with a sinking feeling that they might never forgive me. My own mother's eyes would narrow, her lips press into that thin line she reserved for disappointment, and my cousins, who had always mocked my thriftiness and independent streak, would surely see this as betrayal incarnate. I remembered the last family gathering, the one where my grandmother had seemed unusually quiet, almost contemplative. We had gathered for my uncle's retirement party, the champagne glasses clinking, the jazz softly playing in the background, and I had noticed Eleanor's eyes linger on me in a way that felt like a secret shared between us alone. At the time, I thought it was pride or affection. Now, I realized it had been strategy, calculation, maybe even a spark of mischief. She had known this moment would come, had known how it would feel in the marrow of my bones when I realized that her fortune and the power, influence, and leverage that came with it was mine alone. The thought made my pulse race and my stomach twist. I had always craved freedom, and suddenly it was here, but with a weight heavier than I had ever imagined. The lawyer leaned forward, his gray eyes reflecting a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "Ms. Liddell, your grandmother's instructions are explicit," he said, sliding a folder across the mahogany desk. "You are to receive full control over her assets immediately upon confirmation. No other family members have any claim." I took the folder, feeling the texture of the embossed seal beneath my fingertips, and I could almost hear my grandmother's voice whispering, "Harper, now the world is yours. Watch carefully, for they will come." And in that instant, I knew what she meant. I knew the whispers would start, the threats would begin, the envy would rise like a storm. It wasn't just money, it was power, and power always changes people, sometimes for the worst. I thought about my apartment in Brooklyn with its cracked walls and faded hardwood floors, the small kitchenette where I had cried over heartbreaks and overpaying rent. That apartment suddenly seemed inadequate, almost insulting compared to the world my grandmother had handed me. $3 billion could buy penthouses, yachts, companies, influence, and silence. It could buy revenge for slights, opportunities for friends, punishment for enemies. I had never imagined I would hold such control, such potential to reshape everything I had ever known about my family. And yet, as thrilling as it was, fear gnawed at the edges of my exhilaration. I knew in my bones that this inheritance was not a gift, it was a weapon, and I had just been handed the trigger. The memory of my childhood flashed sharply. Thanksgiving dinners where my cousins stole the best slices of pumpkin pie, my uncle's dismissive remarks whenever I spoke of my ambitions, the long afternoons when my parents argued in the kitchen while I hid in Eleanor's study, listening to the faint hum of her typewriter and the tick of the grandfather clock. I had always felt smaller than everyone else, like my worth needed proof. And now proof had arrived, not just proof, but dominance. I was no longer small, no longer overlooked, no longer the target of whispered mockery. I was the one who held the key to the future of every single person who had ever made me feel inferior. And as I realized this, a dark thrill coursed through me, a sensation I had never known, the intoxicating taste of impending revenge. I remembered my grandmother's warning, the one she had whispered the night before she passed. They will hate you. They always hate what they cannot control. But remember, Harper, hate is nothing compared to clarity. You will know exactly what to do. At the time, I had shivered, not fully understanding what she meant. Now, with the lawyer's words still ringing in my ears, the full weight of her instructions became terrifyingly clear. My family would never forgive me, and maybe, in some small corner of my heart, I was relieved. For the first time in years, I could act entirely on my own terms, without compromise, without apology, without fear. The world that had always seemed cramped and oppressive suddenly spread before me like a field of endless possibilities, and I could feel the rush of adrenaline as I imagined the steps ahead. I left the office and stepped into the brisk Manhattan air, feeling like the world itself had shifted beneath my feet. The buildings loomed taller, the people busier, and yet, for the first time, I felt untouchable. I could walk past my relatives without explanation, answer questions with calm indifference, and smile while they seethed. The power I now held was invisible, but it radiated from me in every movement, every glance. I knew that soon my life would be a battlefield of subtle manipulations, careful confrontations, and quiet, devastating victories. I felt a shiver of excitement at the thought of what I could accomplish, the changes I could make, the debts I could settle, some monetarily, some emotionally. And yet, a small voice inside me whispered caution. This kind of power never comes without consequences. I thought about my parents, about the cousins who had always jeered at me, about the whispers that would travel through the family like wildfire. Could I hold on to my morality, my sense of self, while wielding this fortune like a sword? Or would I become the very thing I had always despised, the manipulator, the schemer, the source of ruin? The questions were suffocating, but I also felt a strange exhilaration. Eleanor had left me not just wealth, but a test, and I intended to pass it, even if the world burned around me. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, the folder of legal documents open on the coffee table, and I let myself imagine every reaction: my mother's trembling hands, my father's cold stare, my cousin's incredulous laughter turning to venom. I thought about how I could use the money to rewrite the narrative of my life, to exact justice for years of ridicule and oversight. But then I remembered my grandmother's final words once more. They will hate you, but they will never see it coming. Not yet, not ever. And in that moment, I felt both fear and triumph, understanding that my life was about to change forever. And that change would not be gentle. As I drifted into a restless sleep, visions of confrontation and opportunity collided in my mind. I could see the city as a chessboard, each family member a piece unaware of the game being played around them. And at the center of it all stood me, Harper Liddell, the granddaughter who had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. Now, armed with $3 billion and a grandmother's secret trust, I was ready to move pieces, topple pawns, and claim the victory that had been denied to me for so long. But the question lingered, as dark and sharp as a knife in the back. Could I win without losing myself in the process? Or would the pursuit of revenge consume me entirely, leaving nothing but ashes where love and family had once been? If you want to see how my family's world explodes and how I begin my journey of revenge, make sure to subscribe and follow along. You won't want to miss what happens next. I can still remember the night my parents told me I wasn't like the rest of the family. I was 14, sitting on the worn-out couch in our suburban Chicago living room, the flicker of the television casting shadows on the walls. My mother, Claudia, had her arms crossed, her lips pressed into that thin, judgmental line she always wore when disappointment filled her veins. My father, Thomas, leaned against the doorway, shaking his head in silent agreement. "Harper, you don't belong here," my mother said, her voice sharp as broken glass. I remember the sting, the sudden rush of tears, but more than anything, the anger that bubbled beneath my chest. That moment planted a seed, one that lay dormant for years, quietly reminding me that love in our family was conditional and respect was something I would always have to fight for, or take. The family dinners were the worst. My cousins, all perfectly groomed, laughing at jokes I didn't understand, shoving mashed potatoes onto each other's plates, while I sat quietly, invisible. My uncle would tell stories of his high school triumphs, exaggerating every detail, expecting applause that never came for me. And when I spoke, offering insights or dreams, I was met with polite nods that barely concealed annoyance. I hated those nods. I hated how small I felt, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a hurricane. It was during those dinners that I first began imagining what it would feel like to be the one with the power, the one whose words mattered, whose presence could shift the room, whose life could no longer be ignored. I vowed that someday they would see me differently. The turning point came when I was 17, the year I got accepted into a prestigious art program in New York. I had poured my soul into every painting, every sketch, every color and brushstroke, hoping to make something beautiful, something lasting. I ran to my parents with the acceptance letter, breathless with excitement, expecting hugs, cheers, validation. Instead, my father frowned. "Harper, that's not practical," he said, shaking his head. My mother sighed, pressing her lips together. "Why can't you do something normal, something stable?" Their disappointment felt like a physical blow, and I remember slamming the door behind me, feeling my chest heaving, my knuckles white from gripping the handle. I realized then that their love was tied to control, and control was something I would have to wrest from them if I wanted to breathe. Grandmother Eleanor had noticed my pain. She had always noticed. That summer, she invited me to stay with her in Manhattan, a rare privilege. Her penthouse overlooked the skyline, the city buzzing below like an endless heartbeat, and I felt alive for the first time in years. She didn't scold me for my choices, didn't try to shape me into someone I wasn't. Instead, she showed me a world I had only glimpsed in my dreams. Museums, galleries, private libraries stacked with leather-bound books, secret gardens tucked behind wrought iron gates. She whispered stories of triumph and betrayal, teaching me that life favored the bold, the daring, the ones willing to take risks while others hesitated. For the first time, I understood the intoxicating power of independence. It was also during that summer that I saw my first hint of the family's jealousy toward me. My cousins had come to visit, their faces bright with false smiles. I noticed the glances exchanged when I mentioned my scholarship, the way their eyes darkened when Eleanor praised my work. I felt the heat of their resentment like a sunburn, and I realized that envy was something I could wield carefully, subtly, like a blade in the dark. I practiced walking into rooms with quiet confidence, speaking with measured tone, letting them underestimate me while I cataloged their weaknesses. Every slight, every whispered insult, every dismissive glance became fuel, tiny embers accumulating into a fire that would one day burn through the family's carefully curated facade. The first time I tasted revenge, even in its smallest form, it was exhilarating. My cousin, Marlowe, had been bragging about a scholarship he thought he'd gotten, and I, knowing the truth, had let him bask in imagined glory just long enough before sending the acceptance email for the correct recipient, knowing full well he would see it later. The look on his face when he realized his mistake, the disbelief, the anger, oh, it was delicious. I didn't gloat, not openly. I merely smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement to myself that I was learning, growing, and beginning to understand the intricate dance of power, influence, and revenge. That moment, though trivial to an outsider, cemented a truth I would carry forever. Justice felt better when it was served quietly, thoughtfully, and with precision. College brought both liberation and new battles. I moved to New York, away from my parents' constant supervision, yet the ghosts of my childhood followed me. Family members called, texts arrived, subtle jabs hidden in phrases like, "Hope you're enjoying your life up there while the rest of us work hard." I learned to respond minimally, to let silence speak louder than words. I also cultivated friendships, allies who respected me for my mind and ambition, who encouraged my creativity instead of diminishing it. Each victory in life, an exhibition, a publication, a recognition, felt like a small step toward reclaiming the self I had lost in the shadow of my family's disdain. And all the while, Eleanor's lessons echoed in my mind, guiding me, shaping my understanding of the world. The summer before my 23rd birthday, Eleanor fell ill. I remember rushing to her side, heart pounding, the sterile smell of the hospital corridors assaulting me. She grabbed my hand, her skin thin and delicate, her eyes fierce despite weakness. "Harper," she whispered, "it's time you understand what family really is. They will never understand your worth, your vision. But you must. You have the fire, and they have only chains. Remember that." Tears blurred my vision as I nodded, gripping her hand tightly. In that moment, I felt an unspoken promise pass between us, that whatever came next, whatever battles lay ahead, I would emerge stronger, smarter, and, if necessary, ruthless. That promise would guide me when the inheritance arrived, when the storm I had sensed my entire life finally broke. I thought about the weeks following her passing, the funeral attended by dozens of relatives, all of them murmuring condolences, but with eyes that betrayed suspicion, envy, and greed. I smiled faintly, keeping my head bowed, pretending to mourn, but inside I was calculating, observing, storing every word, every gesture, every slight in a mental ledger. I realized then that grief and strategy could coexist, that outward emotion need not reveal the fire burning beneath. I could mourn and simultaneously prepare, simultaneously plan, simultaneously anticipate the chaos I would unleash once my grandmother's fortune passed into my hands. The first contact from the lawyer came unexpectedly. A phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, mundane and ordinary in tone, but carrying a message that would redefine my life. Eleanor's voice seemed to echo through every word, every pause, every deliberate syllable. The fortune was mine. I could still feel the adrenaline that surged through me, a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and anticipation. The family would never forgive me. They would scheme, manipulate, and accuse. And yet the power to respond, the power to act, to wield this inheritance as both shield and sword was entirely mine. That realization hit me harder than any slap, hug, or insult I had ever received. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, liberating. I thought about the revenge I would enact, the subtle, precise, carefully calculated moves that would slowly dismantle the hierarchy of envy and arrogance in my family. I didn't crave destruction for its own sake. I craved recognition, acknowledgement, and justice. Each slight, each dismissal, each sneer that had ever been thrown at me would be answered in ways they couldn't anticipate. I would not stoop to open malice. I would elevate myself above the fray, wielding the inheritance like a scalpel rather than a hammer, cutting away the arrogance, pride, and cruelty that had defined my childhood. The anticipation alone made my heart pound, my palms sweat, my mind race with endless possibilities. And then, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment that night, visions of my family's reactions swirled through my mind. My parents, frozen with disbelief. My cousins, seething with envy and rage. My uncle, finally confronted with the truth that I was no longer the powerless, ignored girl he had once dismissed. I smiled faintly, tasting the thrill of the coming storm, knowing that I was ready, that I had trained for this moment my entire life, even if I hadn't realized it. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was freedom, clarity, and, above all, justice. And with it, the game had only just begun. But as I closed my eyes that night, the last thought that crept into my mind was sharp and chilling. If the family knew what I was capable of, what I had already learned from years of quiet observation and careful planning, would they even attempt to stop me, or would they crumble before I had even made my first move? The first time I confronted my parents after learning about the inheritance, it was like stepping onto a battlefield I had been training for my entire life. I invited them over to my apartment under the pretense of a casual dinner, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic filling the cramped space. Claudia and Thomas arrived, their smiles tight, eyes darting, as if they suspected that something monumental had already occurred. I poured wine with deliberate slowness, each movement a silent assertion of control, and watched them fidget, small signs betraying their attempts at composure. I let the silence stretch, the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Finally, I leaned back in my chair, meeting their eyes evenly, and said, "I have news that will change everything, and there's nothing you can do about it." Their faces paled, their hands froze mid-gesture, and I could feel the first ripples of chaos spreading. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice tight, strained with disbelief. "Harper, what are you talking about?" I smiled faintly, letting my words linger. "Grandmother left me her entire estate. All of it." The words hit them like a blow, the room thick with shock, the air suddenly heavy. I could see Claudia's jaw tighten, her lips pressing together in that familiar thin line of suppressed fury. "All of it? You mean you?" she stammered, eyes narrowing, disbelief and resentment battling on her face. My pulse raced, but I stayed calm, deliberately collecting my thoughts. This was not just a conversation. It was the first move in a long, calculated game, and I intended to play it well, letting them realize the full scope of what they had lost before I made my next move. The dinner was unbearable, a delicate dance of polite words and simmering hostility. I spoke carefully, revealing nothing but enough hints to unsettle them. Thomas tried to mask his anger, making small jokes that fell flat, while Claudia attacked subtly, under the guise of concern. "Are you sure you can handle it, Harper?" she asked, her tone dripping with doubt. I smiled, my lips barely moving. "I think I'll manage. I said softly, letting the words linger. Inside, I was thrilled, exhilarated by their reactions, their inability to control the narrative. For years, they had underestimated me, dismissed me, told me I would never amount to anything. Now, with Eleanor's fortune as my shield and sword, I could finally show them how wrong they had been, and the thrill of that realization sent a shiver down my spine. I spent the following weeks orchestrating subtle displays of my new power, small yet deliberate, enough to unsettle my family without appearing overtly threatening. I hired a personal assistant, a financial advisor, and a private security consultant, all under the guise of planning my future, but their presence served as a quiet reminder to my relatives that I had stepped into a world they could not control. Invitations arrived for gallery openings, charity events, and exclusive parties, and I attended with quiet confidence, smiling politely at familiar faces while letting the whispers of my newfound status circulate. Every glance, every murmur, every tentative acknowledgement from the family felt like a tiny victory, proof that the game had begun, and I was already winning. My cousins were the hardest to unsettle, their envy sharp, almost tangible in the air, when they realized I had surpassed them without effort. Marlowe tried to mask his jealousy with forced charm, laughing too loudly, attempting to dominate conversations with stories of supposed achievements. I listened, nodding, letting him bask in imagined superiority before casually dropping hints about recent investments, acquisitions, and decisions that left him fumbling for a response. The subtle look of panic on his face thrilled me, a reminder that envy was a weapon I could wield, and he, like the others, was entirely unprepared for it. The thought that my grandmother had set me up for this exact moment made my pulse quicken and my resolve harden. I began documenting every slight, every insult, every dismissive gesture that had shaped my childhood, creating a mental map of grievances, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Each entry fueled my strategy, shaping my approach to the coming months. My parents, oblivious to the depth of my planning, continued their attempts at manipulation, not realizing that their words and actions were only sharpening my precision. I had learned early that family conflicts were not won with anger or impulsive retaliation, but with careful observation, patience, and timing. Every whispered comment, every glance, every subtle dig was cataloged and stored, a piece of the puzzle that would soon be assembled into a full, devastating picture of reckoning. The first tangible act of revenge came unexpectedly. My father had always boasted about his retirement plan, a supposed nest egg he claimed would secure his future. Using my newfound influence, I discreetly acquired information that exposed the flaws and mismanagement in his investments. I approached him, feigning concern, offering advice as though I were helping him avoid a catastrophe. His pride made him defensive, his ego unable to accept guidance from the child he had dismissed for decades. When he realized the truth, that I had quietly secured leverage over him without his knowledge, the look of shock and fear on his face was intoxicating. It was a small victory, but a necessary first step in dismantling the hierarchy of control. Meanwhile, Claudia began her own subtle campaigns, trying to guilt me, manipulate me, and shame me into compliance. I listened carefully, responding with patience, empathy, and calm neutrality, letting her words lose power through inaction. Each attempt at persuasion revealed more about her insecurities, her fears, and the depth of her envy. I started keeping detailed records, not just of finances, but of emotions, reactions, and tendencies. Every conversation, every visit, every text message became material for analysis, and I relished the growing clarity. Eleanor had prepared me for this moment, not just financially, but strategically, and I intended to honor her lessons fully. The cousins' attempts at undermining me were more direct, though equally ineffective. Invitations were sent to parties I wasn't meant to attend, Gossip circulated about my life choices, subtle rumors about my character were whispered in social circles. Each attack was met with deliberate indifference, a quiet smile, and sometimes a public display of success that rendered their efforts laughable. It was a delicate balance, requiring poise, timing, and careful calculation, but the thrill of outmaneuvering them without overt confrontation was exhilarating. I felt the growing power of control, of being untouchable yet still engaged in the intricate dance of revenge. I began cultivating allies outside the family, individuals who respected my vision and intelligence, who could provide both support and validation. Art curators, financial consultants, socialites, and journalists became part of my expanding network, people who could amplify my influence, protect my interests, and, if necessary, assist in the delicate dismantling of familial authority. Each connection, each carefully nurtured relationship was a chess piece on the board, and I was the player who saw every move in advance. The network extended my reach, ensuring that every whisper, every maneuver, every calculated act of revenge could be reinforced by allies who understood the stakes. Then came the first public test, a family gathering for the summer holidays. My parents insisted I attend, hoping to confront me, manipulate me, or perhaps intimidate me into submission. I entered the house with calm authority, dressed elegantly, radiating confidence. The whispers began immediately, the glances exchanged between relatives sharp and calculating. I smiled faintly, aware of every eye on me, every thought they tried to conceal. The air was thick with tension, a storm waiting to break, and I reveled in the quiet anticipation. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and ridiculed for too long, and now, with the power of Eleanor's inheritance and my carefully cultivated strategy, I was ready to assert myself in ways that would leave them reeling. The first confrontation was subtle but unforgettable. My mother, eyes blazing with suppressed fury, tried to guilt me about family loyalty, the idea that I was somehow betraying everyone by accepting Eleanor's gift. I responded calmly, each word chosen with care, acknowledging her emotions without surrendering power. The tension in the room escalated as cousins whispered behind cupped hands, my father's pride warring with fear. By the end of the evening, it was clear. I was no longer the powerless granddaughter. I had claimed a seat at the table, not just symbolically, but in a way that reshaped the dynamics of the entire family. And the look on their faces, shock, disbelief, and envy, was more satisfying than any applause I had ever received. As I left the gathering that night, the city lights of New York sparkling below my apartment, I felt a mix of exhilaration and anticipation. The first steps had been taken, the initial moves carefully executed, and the family was already reeling from the reality that I had become untouchable. Yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The real games, the intricate manipulations, and the moments that would define my family's perception of me were still to come. And I was ready. The inheritance was not just a gift. It was a weapon, a shield, and a key. But as I lay in bed that night, a sudden thought pierced my exhilaration like a cold blade. Someone in the family might try to strike first, preemptively, in ways I couldn't anticipate. The realization made my heart pound, my mind race, and my adrenaline surge. The question was no longer whether I would wield my power, but whether I could anticipate every possible betrayal before it came, and whether I was ready for the first real challenge. And that challenge, I sensed, was already moving closer, unseen but inevitable. The first time I realized that my family would not simply bow to my power was the night Marlowe cornered me at a charity gala in Manhattan. The chandeliers sparkled above us, casting fractured light across the marble floors, but all I noticed was the fury in his green eyes. He stepped close, too close, his voice low and strained. "Harper, you think you can just take everything from us? From me?" I smiled faintly, letting the soft elegance of my posture and the calculated calm in my voice disarm him. "I didn't take anything," I said. "Grandmother left it to me. She made a choice. That's all." His jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the envy and rage that had been quietly growing for years, and I knew the game had officially escalated. The subtle power struggle became impossible to ignore after that night. Invitations from the family came with hidden agendas, attempts to trap me, to embarrass me in front of friends, colleagues, and potential allies. I learned to arrive late, leave early, or simply avoid situations where their influence could overshadow my own. Each time, I watched their expressions, cataloging anger, frustration, and disbelief as I maneuvered through the traps they set. It was intoxicating, the thrill of knowing they could not control me, that no matter how loudly they protested or schemed, I remained untouchable. Their whispers became my soundtrack, their tension a testament to my growing influence. And I reveled quietly in their failure to anticipate my moves. Claudia's tactics were more psychological, subtle, yet sharp. She tried to make me feel guilty, to manipulate me through appeals to emotion, family loyalty, and shared history. "Harper, don't let money destroy you," she warned during one particularly tense phone call. I let her words drift past, calm as a lake in winter, while my mind mapped her vulnerabilities and motives. Each attempt she made to influence me inadvertently revealed her insecurities and weaknesses, allowing me to plan my next steps with precision. I realized then that control in our family had always been tied to manipulation and fear, and now I had learned to wield both subtly, invisibly, ensuring that every move worked in my favor. Marlowe, however, was less subtle. He attempted public challenges, questioning my judgment and decisions during family gatherings and social events. I learned quickly how to counter, never with aggression, but with quiet authority, a few carefully chosen words, a poised demeanor, and the eyes of the crowd shifted, silently validating me while his confidence crumbled. Each encounter strengthened my understanding of power, influence, and perception. I began to recognize that revenge was not about overt destruction. It was about control, about rewriting the rules without anyone realizing it until it was too late. The realization was exhilarating, almost addictive, and I could feel my grandmother's lessons guiding me at every turn. One evening, my parents invited me to dinner at a suburban estate far from the city under the guise of reconciliation. I arrived calm and polished, knowing the night would reveal more than just emotions. It would expose their strategy. The house smelled faintly of old wood and vanilla, the air tense with unspoken hostility. My mother's eyes flicked toward me constantly, my father's jaw set tight, and I felt the subtle power shift in the room as I walked in with quiet confidence. I knew every word, every movement would be scrutinized. This was a battlefield disguised as a family dinner, and I was prepared, armed with patience, strategy, and the quiet thrill of knowing that I already held the upper hand. During dinner, the accusations began, thinly veiled under concerns about my spending, my social circles, and my career choices. "Are you sure you're making the right decisions?" Claudia asked, her tone deceptively gentle. Thomas added, "You've never been practical. Are you really ready for all this responsibility?" I smiled faintly, sipping my wine, letting their words hang in the air like smoke before dissipating. Every accusation, every hidden insult was cataloged, analyzed, and converted into fuel for the next stage of my plan. I realized that their attempts to undermine me only revealed their weaknesses, and I was learning how to use their insecurities against them without appearing aggressive. By the time dessert arrived, I had already begun planting seeds of doubt and distraction, casually mentioning potential investments, philanthropic opportunities, and plans for social impact. Their eyes widened, a mixture of envy and fear showing clearly despite their attempts at composure. I could sense the shift, the realization that I had stepped into a realm they had never understood and might never control. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the ripple effect began immediately. Conversations were cut short, glances exchanged, and the energy in the room became taut with tension. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing the first true cracks were appearing in the family's carefully constructed armor. Marlowe attempted one final move that evening, a direct challenge to my authority, questioning my ability to manage investments and alliances. I allowed him to finish, then leaned forward slightly, voice calm, eyes steady, radiating quiet confidence. "Marlowe, your concern is noted, but you are not in control here," I said softly. The silence that followed was deafening, a visible shift in the room as all eyes turned to me. Even my parents seemed momentarily stunned, as if seeing me for the first time. That moment confirmed what I had already known. The family underestimated me at their peril, and I had only just begun to assert my dominance in a way that would be felt in every interaction moving forward. I spent the following weeks strategically reinforcing my influence. Invitations to social and professional circles became tools, subtly broadcasting my power while highlighting my sophistication. Friends and allies in media and finance were carefully positioned to support my narrative, ensuring that any attempt to undermine me would meet resistance from multiple fronts. I even began drafting proposals for charitable initiatives and investments, ensuring that my name and reputation were associated with leadership, intelligence, and vision. Every move, no matter how small, was designed to elevate my position while maintaining a veneer of elegance, calm, and legitimacy. The first tangible victories began to emerge. Cousins who had mocked me suddenly found themselves marginalized in social and professional networks. My parents' subtle attempts at control were neutralized by careful planning, strategic alliances, and precise interventions. The thrill of watching them flounder, unable to anticipate or counteract my actions, was intoxicating. Yet I remained vigilant, understanding that one misstep could undo months of careful maneuvering. Every conversation, every gesture, every subtle reaction was a potential threat, and I learned to treat each interaction as both an opportunity and a test. Then came the first real act of defiance from the family. Marlowe attempted to leverage business contacts to challenge my investments and influence in the city. I anticipated the move, having prepared detailed countermeasures weeks in advance. The confrontation was quiet but devastating. His allies were subtly convinced to withdraw support, contracts were delayed, and his credibility subtly undermined in public circles. Watching him struggle, powerless despite all his preparation and pride, was a reminder of how far I had come. Revenge was not about immediate destruction. It was about strategic control, patient planning, and careful execution. And I had learned to play the game flawlessly. But as the victories accumulated, I felt the first twinges of doubt. The power I wielded was intoxicating, exhilarating, and terrifying. I realized that the stakes were higher than I had imagined. Every move I made would be scrutinized, every action interpreted, and any miscalculation could shift momentum back to my adversaries. I had achieved a level of influence and control I had once dreamed of, but the weight of responsibility, strategy, and anticipation pressed heavily on my shoulders. Even as the family scrambled to understand and counter my moves, I knew the game was far from over. And then, one evening, a letter arrived at my apartment, and signed, the words scrawled in a hand I recognized immediately. "You may have won the battles, Harper, but the war has only begun." My heart froze as I read it, a cold realization settling into my chest. Someone was watching, someone was planning, and the next moves would be crucial. I knew, in that moment, that the delicate balance of power, manipulation, and strategy one had cultivated would be tested like never before. The game had entered a dangerous new phase, and I could sense the storm on the horizon, invisible yet inevitable. The letter had rattled me more than I cared to admit. I paced my apartment that night, the skyline of New York blurred behind rain-streaked windows, heart hammering in my chest. Someone in my family, or close to them, was planning against me, testing my patience, my vigilance, and perhaps even my sanity. I felt a thrill of fear mingled with determination. Fear because it reminded me that even power had its limits. Determination because I realized Eleanor's lessons had prepared me for exactly this kind of storm. I pored over my notes, my carefully maintained mental ledger of grudges, alliances, and weaknesses. Every insult, slight, and betrayal became a potential tool, a lever I could use to anticipate moves, deflect attacks, and reclaim dominance. The war was no longer abstract. It had arrived at my door, tangible, deliberate, and deadly in its subtlety. I began the first phase of my counter-strategy with careful observation. Family members' schedules, meetings, and social events were tracked discreetly, analyzed for vulnerabilities. I watched interactions, noting patterns of behavior, subtle tells, and emotional triggers. Every conversation became a test, every glance a clue, every small action a potential threat or opportunity. I realized that the anonymous letter was both a warning and a challenge, a confirmation that my family was beginning to respect my influence, though unwillingly. Their hate had grown into action, and that action would either be their undoing or mine. I could feel the tension building like coiled wire. Every interaction loaded with potential consequences. Marlowe's first misstep was predictable. Driven by pride, he attempted a public challenge at a financial seminar, positioning himself as a critic of my philanthropic ventures. He underestimated my preparation, my knowledge, and the alliances I had carefully cultivated. With subtle counterpoints, calm authority, and measured confidence, I dismantled his assertions, leaving the audience impressed and him flustered. The look on his face as he realized the failure of his plan was exquisite, pride crushed, ego exposed, influence diminished. It was a small victory, but a significant one, a reminder that patience, preparation, and precision were more powerful than brute force or impulsive retaliation. Eleanor's teachings echoed in my mind with each move, each calculated step reaffirming that strategy always outweighed emotion. Meanwhile, my parents escalated in their own way, attempting to guilt me into compliance. Claudia called repeatedly, weaving stories of family tradition, shared history, and moral obligation. Each call was met with calm acknowledgement, but no action. I refused to give them the leverage they craved, the emotional reaction, the admission of weakness, the hint of uncertainty. Instead, I documented each attempt, recording tone, phrasing, and emotional undercurrents, converting them into tools I could use to anticipate future manipulations. Each failed attempt by them only solidified my confidence, demonstrating that the power balance had irrevocably shifted. I had become the architect of influence, and they were increasingly powerless to alter the structure I had begun to build. The cousins tried subtle manipulations next. Invitations to events I wasn't supposed to attend, veiled criticisms during public gatherings, whispers behind my back. Each attempt was a test, and each failure taught me more about their insecurities, ambitions, and limitations. I learned to let them operate freely, observing rather than reacting, cataloging every misstep. By the time they realized my immunity to their tactics, it was too late. Their actions had inadvertently provided me insight, influence, and leverage. My patience, once criticized as aloofness, became my weapon. By letting them underestimate me, I cultivated the perfect environment to enact more sophisticated strategies, ones that would dismantle their pride and force recognition of my authority. One afternoon, a subtle opportunity presented itself. Marlowe had been boasting to mutual acquaintances about a supposed business acquisition he had orchestrated. I had already verified through discreet channels that the deal was contingent on questionable approvals and unreliable partners. Waiting for the perfect moment, I gently reminded one of the key players of the obligations and consequences, letting the truth surface slowly but inevitably. By the time Marlowe realized the unraveling of his plan, the damage was complete, executed quietly, cleanly, and irreversibly. Watching him scramble, powerless and humiliated, confirmed the efficiency of subtle, strategic revenge. I felt the same thrill Eleanor must have felt in her prime, a reminder that power and foresight were more intoxicating than money alone. Yet, even as victories accumulated, I remained aware of the dangers. The anonymous letter had reminded me that someone was watching, waiting, plotting. Each day, I scanned emails, monitored correspondence, and considered motives with meticulous care. I knew that any miscalculation could tip the balance, turning a small victory into a disaster. The tension was constant, a quiet pressure in the back of my mind, urging me to maintain vigilance while executing my plans. Eleanor's lessons had prepared me, but no training could eliminate the anxiety of knowing that the next move could define the war for better or worse. The family gatherings became arenas of subtle dominance. My presence alone, calm and composed, created ripples of unease. My parents' glances betrayed worry, cousins whispered to one another, and Marlowe's attempts at superiority were consistently undermined by my quiet confidence. Every smile, gesture, or acknowledgement was deliberately calibrated to signal strength without aggression. By remaining unshaken, I forced recognition of my authority, reinforcing the perception of power that had previously been invisible. The psychological advantage was undeniable. Control of perception became as important as control of assets. Eleanor's strategy was working through me, a living testament to her foresight and understanding of human nature. At the same time, I cultivated allies outside the family who could amplify my influence. Friends in finance, media, and social circles became subtle instruments, able to support my narrative, provide validation, and protect against attacks. Each relationship was nurtured strategically, ensuring that my position could not easily be undermined. This network became invisible armor, a safety net, and a silent weapon. I realized that influence extended beyond direct confrontation. It was the ability to shape perception, control information, and direct outcomes without drawing attention. Eleanor's teachings on patience, foresight, and indirect power were alive in every move, every decision, every carefully orchestrated step. Then, one evening, the tension escalated unexpectedly. A relative I had never fully trusted, distant and unassuming, approached me with a veiled threat disguised as concern. "Harper, some things are better left alone," the voice whispered, eyes flicking toward the shadows, as if someone else might be listening. I smiled softly, the calm in my expression masking the rush of adrenaline and calculation within. I listened, cataloged, and responded with measured politeness, but inside, I mapped potential consequences, alliances, and weaknesses. The warning was a sign that the family's desperation was growing. They recognized the threat I posed, and they were beginning to act. It was both exhilarating and dangerous, a reminder that vigilance had to remain constant. That night, I reviewed the mental ledger I had maintained for years, now updated with months of observations, interactions, and failed attempts to undermine me. Every name, every motive, every weakness was documented. I began drafting strategies not only for defense but for escalation, precise moves that could consolidate my influence while exposing vulnerabilities in their attempts to manipulate, threaten, or embarrass me. The game had evolved from subtle revenge to complex warfare, and I felt the weight of responsibility, power and anticipation settle over me like a cloak. I had stepped fully into Eleanor's world, and the consequences, thrilling and terrifying, were mine to navigate. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep that night, a single thought haunted me: the anonymous letter, the veiled threat, the subtle escalation from the family, all suggested that someone was already orchestrating a move I had not yet anticipated. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. No matter how carefully I planned, no matter how flawlessly I executed strategies, there were unknown variables, hidden enemies, and unseen threats that could upend the delicate balance I had created. And in that moment, I knew that the true battle had only just begun. The first whispers of real sabotage reached me unexpectedly, hidden in an email from a distant relative I barely knew, her words coded in faux concern but brimming with subtle threat. "Be careful, Harper. Power has a way of isolating even the strongest." My pulse quickened as I read the lines over and over, feeling the weight of a challenge I had not anticipated. Someone was moving against me, not clumsily, as Marlowe or my parents might, but deliberately, strategically, and quietly. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Eleanor had taught me to anticipate betrayal, yet this felt like a chess game where I had not yet seen the pieces. I sat back in my chair, eyes scanning the New York skyline beyond my apartment, thinking through every interaction, every family gathering, every whisper, preparing to meet this new threat with the same calculated precision that had brought me victories before. I began retracing the steps of the past months, looking for signs I might have overlooked, subtle gestures, fleeting expressions, inconsistencies in stories. Slowly, patterns emerged, connections between events I had dismissed as coincidence and now appeared intentional. Every interaction became a puzzle piece, every vague warning a thread to be followed. I realized the family's desperation was evolving. They were learning, adapting, and attempting moves beyond my initial calculations. It was thrilling and terrifying at once. The adrenaline fueled my focus, sharpening every thought. I plotted countermeasures, scenarios, contingencies, all cataloged in my mental ledger. This was no longer merely a game of influence. It had become a war of wits, patience, and subtle manipulation, where every misstep could have consequences beyond anything I had faced before. Marlowe was the obvious first suspect. Pride, envy, and resentment drove him toward reckless attempts to undermine me. And yet this felt different. His movements were too cautious, too calculated, and that unsettled me. Someone else had learned the lessons I had imposed on him. Perhaps an ally, perhaps someone even more cunning. I began carefully observing family interactions, social events, and subtle dynamics, searching for the one who had stepped into the shadows. It was a slow process, requiring patience and constant vigilance. I realized that victory in this war depended on my ability to anticipate invisible moves, to see what others thought I could not, and to act decisively before the threat became tangible. To prepare, I expanded my network, enlisting allies outside the family who could provide intelligence, insight, and subtle influence. Friends in finance, media, and social circles became surveillance points, informants, and validation agents. I cultivated them carefully, never revealing desperation. Only purpose, only calm authority. Through them, I began gathering hints of clandestine moves. Meetings, whispered conversations, subtle gestures that indicated someone was coordinating against me. Each discovery became fuel for strategy, each insight a weapon. I realized that even as the enemy's identity remained uncertain, the leverage of anticipation, preparation, and subtle influence could keep me several moves ahead, as Eleanor had taught me. The first direct test came at a family luncheon, orchestrated as a public demonstration of unity, though I knew better. From the moment I arrived, the energy in the room was different, tight, brittle, loaded with intention. Every glance, Every smile, every casual conversation carried subtle undertones of strategy. I moved deliberately, maintaining calm, observing reactions, cataloging gestures, and noting inconsistencies. Claudia attempted guilt, Marlowe tried intimidation, and even distant relatives sent veiled warnings, each carefully masked as concern. I felt the storm approaching, invisible yet palpable, and knew that patience would be my weapon. One wrong move could give them the advantage. I allowed myself small victories of observation, subtle tests, and quiet dominance, letting them underestimate the depth of my awareness. By mid-afternoon, I had narrowed down the likely orchestrator of the subtle sabotage. It was my cousin Felicity, usually overlooked, soft-spoken, and polite, but with eyes that never missed a detail. Watching her now, I saw the tension in her posture, the quick glances at hidden allies, the micro-expressions that betrayed calculation. She had studied me, observed patterns, and prepared a counter-strategy. I realized the lesson Eleanor had always whispered. The quiet ones were often the most dangerous. I smiled faintly, letting her underestimate my awareness as I prepared my first move to reclaim control. In that moment, I understood that power was not only what you held, but what others believed you could wield. Misperception could be a weapon as sharp as money or influence. I began planting subtle traps during the luncheon, offering information that seemed casual but was deliberately calibrated. Every word, every gesture, every anecdote was a test, bait designed to reveal alliances, weaknesses, and intentions. Felicity took it immediately, moving as expected, unaware she had stepped into my web. The thrill of seeing strategy unfold in real time, the adrenaline of subtle dominance, was intoxicating. I realized that revenge was not only about past wrongs, it was about control, influence, and the quiet, almost invisible dismantling of the arrogance, pride, and malice that had once defined my family. Eleanor's presence, even in memory, guided each step, each decision. Later that evening, after the luncheon ended, I sat in my apartment, reviewing every detail. Each conversation replayed in my mind, each gesture noted, each alliance confirmed. Felicity's pattern of moves became clearer, revealing not only her immediate intentions, but also the hidden vulnerabilities she relied upon. I began drafting a plan to neutralize her influence subtly, quietly, and permanently. The thrill of anticipation was overwhelming. This was the first truly intelligent adversary in my life, someone who understood the game, but not its full scope. I smiled faintly, savoring the intellectual challenge as much as the emotional satisfaction. The following week, I set the plan in motion. I used social influence, subtle misdirection, and carefully positioned allies to isolate Felicity from the network she relied upon. Invitations were rerouted, social connections subtly altered, and her carefully orchestrated manipulations countered quietly. By the time she realized her moves were ineffective, the damage was done. Her credibility began to erode, allies questioned her judgment, and the tension between her and the rest of the family intensified. Watching the subtle collapse of her influence was exhilarating, a confirmation that strategy, patience, and foresight outweighed brute force or impulsive reaction. Even as victories mounted, I remained vigilant. The anonymous letter, the veiled threats, and the subtle sabotage reminded me that the family's determination was growing. Every action, no matter how successful, was only one step in a long campaign. I knew that patience, calculation, and careful observation would be my greatest assets. Every encounter, every family gathering, every whispered warning had become a test of intellect, restraint, and influence. The stakes were higher than ever, and I felt the weight of responsibility, strategy, and anticipation pressing against me, a constant reminder that the game was only beginning. Late one night, A call came from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm but insistent. "Harper, you're playing a dangerous game. Someone is closer than you think. Watch your back." My pulse quickened, the familiar mixture of fear and thrill surging through me. I knew this was Felicity, or an ally, or perhaps someone entirely unexpected, but the warning confirmed one truth: the next moves would be critical, unpredictable, and potentially devastating. I hung up quietly, mind racing, already mapping contingencies, anticipating strategies, and preparing for the invisible storm that was gathering in the shadows. The war of control, revenge, and dominance had escalated, and I was ready. I spent the next days preparing, reviewing strategies, reinforcing alliances, and mapping potential threats. Every detail mattered: subtle gestures, tone, body language, social connections, financial maneuvers. I began drafting contingencies not only for Felicity, but for anyone who might attempt to disrupt my plans. I realized that true power was not in wealth alone. It was in foresight, perception, influence, and the ability to act decisively while remaining invisible. The thrill of strategy, anticipation, and subtle revenge coursed through me like fire. I was ready for whatever came next, for the unseen, for the calculated, for the storm I knew was already moving toward me. And just as I felt the first sense of complete control, another letter arrived, sealed, formal, and unmistakably deliberate. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words chilled me. "You are strong, Harper, but strength can blind you. Trust no one, not even those closest. The next move will test everything you have learned." My heart raced. The warning was precise, intelligent, and terrifying. Someone in my family, or their allies, was orchestrating a counterstrike that could dismantle months of careful planning. The game had evolved, becoming far more dangerous, intricate, and personal than I had imagined. And I knew deep in my bones that I would not be caught unprepared. The first revelation came in a moment I wasn't expecting, late one night while I was reviewing financial reports and social connections. A small discrepancy, almost invisible, caught my eye. A transfer, subtle but deliberate, from an account I thought secure. My pulse quickened, and I immediately traced the transaction. The paper trail led back to a family trust one had assumed was inactive, managed by distant relatives. Someone had moved quietly, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and I realized then that this war was not just about ego, resentment, or inheritance. It was about strategy, intelligence, and foresight. I sat back in my chair, heart hammering, feeling the thrill of danger and opportunity. Whoever had done this had underestimated me, but only slightly. Their arrogance was their weakness, and my grandmother's lessons whispered in my mind. Always anticipate the invisible hand. Always plan for the shadow no one sees. I began reconstructing months of interactions, conversations, and family behavior, searching for subtle cues I might have missed. Every gesture, every remark, every minor incident took on new significance. The pieces slowly formed a pattern. Small alliances forming, subtle manipulations occurring behind the scenes, hidden conflicts being exploited. I realized that this was Felicity, yes, but with silent partners I had never fully suspected. The web was far more intricate than I had imagined. The adrenaline surged through me, mixing with awe at the sophistication of the moves, yet fueling determination. Eleanor had prepared me for many battles, but this was the first time I encountered a foe who could operate with this level of subtlety. I knew I needed to act, and I needed to act decisively. The first step was intelligence gathering. I mobilized my network quietly, efficiently, ensuring that any movement in my orbit was observed and documented. Financial fluctuations, social interactions, whispered conversations, all became data points. My team, though small, was loyal and intelligent, trained to operate without revealing intentions. Each night, I pored over the information, identifying alliances, weaknesses, and opportunities. Slowly, the scope of the sabotage became clear. Felicity was attempting to isolate me from both my social and financial networks, to undermine confidence in my decisions, and to plant seeds of doubt among allies. The subtlety and audacity of her moves were impressive, but they also revealed arrogance, an assumption that I could be blindsided. Once the pattern was clear, I began implementing countermeasures. I subtly rerouted communications, reinforced trust with key allies, and planted controlled misinformation designed to mislead Felicity and her collaborators. Each action was calculated, precise, and invisible. They believed they were manipulating me, yet they were actually being manipulated. I felt a surge of exhilaration as each trap took hold. The thrill of playing a longer, more intricate game than anyone else in my family had ever imagined was intoxicating. I realized that revenge was no longer about retribution, it was about mastery, control, and shaping reality to my vision. Each move strengthened my position, eroded theirs, and revealed the depth of my strategic acumen. Meanwhile, the personal toll became unavoidable. Family members, unaware that I had identified the source of sabotage, increased their pressure on me emotionally. Claudia's calls became more insistent, her tones sharper, trying to provoke fear or guilt. Thomas attempted subtle intimidation, masked as advice, probing my confidence in public and private settings. Marlowe fumed, unaware that his own reckless tactics had made him predictable. I remained outwardly calm, but inside, I cataloged every reaction, every nuance, every lapse in composure. Each attempt to unsettle me became data, a way to deepen my understanding of their psychology. The more they tried, the more I learned, and the more precise my counteractions became. One afternoon, I confronted a small but critical piece of sabotage. Felicity had tried to manipulate a mutual business associate to question my competence, spreading rumors and planting doubts. I approached the associate under the guise of casual conversation, gently correcting misconceptions and subtly undermining Felicity's influence. The shift was immediate. Confidence in me was restored, and doubts about her integrity began to surface. Watching her plans unravel quietly without confrontation gave me a thrill unlike any previous victory. The elegance of indirect strategy, letting others expose themselves while maintaining my own calm authority, was mesmerizing. Eleanor's lessons on patience, observation, and subtlety were alive in that moment, proving once again that power wielded with strategy was nearly unstoppable. As Felicity's influence began to collapse, cracks appeared elsewhere in the family network. Distant relatives, previously aligned with her, started questioning her judgment. Marlowe's desperation increased, making him reckless and predictable. Claudia's guilt trips became desperate attempts to regain influence over me. Each of these failures reinforced my authority, yet I remained cautious, knowing the family was learning. The more victories I accumulated, the more carefully they adapted. I realized that the next stage of the conflict would require not just defense, but active disruption of their coordination. Subtle sabotage of their alliances, control of information, and psychological maneuvering would be necessary to maintain dominance. Then came a personal revelation that shifted everything. While reviewing old correspondence, I discovered letters from Eleanor I had never seen before, documents outlining her views on family dynamics, influence, and the perils of wealth. She had predicted nearly every potential conflict I could face, detailing strategies for both defense and offense, emphasizing the importance of subtlety and patience. Reading her words felt like guidance from beyond the grave. Her understanding of human nature, of pride and envy, of the way power could be wielded quietly was astonishing. The realization that I was following a roadmap crafted specifically for these moments, strengthened my resolve. Eleanor's foresight was uncanny, and I knew I had an advantage that my family could not possibly comprehend. I began implementing a larger, more complex plan. My goal was not only to neutralize Felicity, but to destabilize the entire network of opposition within the family. I orchestrated events, manipulated perceptions, and guided conversations to expose divisions, insecurities, and ambitions that had remained hidden. Subtle hints, carefully timed remarks, and controlled demonstrations of influence began to create cracks. The family, unaware of the scope of my strategy, believed they were maneuvering with confidence, while in reality, they were being carefully herded into positions of disadvantage. The thrill of executing a plan of this magnitude without direct confrontation was intoxicating. Amid these maneuvers, I had moments of reflection. The loneliness of power, the isolation inherent in commanding respect and fear, became apparent. I realized that victory was not about friendship or affection. It was about influence, strategy, and foresight. The exhilaration of success was tempered by awareness of the emotional distance growing between me and those I once loved. Yet I also understood that Eleanor had chosen this path for me, preparing me to wield influence responsibly, patiently, and strategically. My loyalty to her lessons outweighed any personal hesitation. One evening, I arranged a private meeting with Marlowe under the guise of reconciliation. His pride made him confident that he could manipulate me. He did not realize he was walking into a carefully constructed web. I presented information subtly, allowing him to draw conclusions while quietly steering him into miscalculations. Each response he made confirmed my observations: arrogance, impulsiveness, and desperation. By the time he left the meeting, his influence had been undermined quietly and efficiently, without any outward confrontation. It was a victory both strategic and psychological, a reminder that true power often operates unseen. Finally, I consolidated all gathered intelligence into a comprehensive mental map, outlining the family's hierarchy, alliances, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Each interaction, observation, and subtle sabotage was cataloged. I realized that I now held the power to dictate outcomes, manipulate perception, and orchestrate both offense and defense with near certainty. Yet, as I prepared the next phase of action, I sensed that the anonymous letters and veiled warnings were more than just threats. They were clues, hints at an even deeper player in the shadows, someone whose influence had yet to fully reveal itself. The war was escalating, and the most dangerous moves were still ahead. Late that night, as I reviewed the ledger, another envelope arrived. No name, no return address. Inside was a single note. "You are clever, Harper, but cleverness can be your weakness. Watch those closest to you. The game is not what it seems." My hands trembled slightly, heart racing. The message confirmed my suspicion. There was an unseen adversary, operating quietly, waiting for the right moment. My victories, though impressive, were only part of a larger, more dangerous game. I realized that while I had outmaneuvered visible threats, a hidden force was preparing to strike. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever, threatening not only power but everything I had built. The first breakthrough came late one evening when I was scanning old family records for overlooked details. A document, hidden among decades of financial paperwork, revealed transfers and communications that didn't match the official ledger. My pulse quickened as I realized this was no longer merely Felicity or Marlowe plotting against me. It was someone far more calculated, operating in silence for years, gathering power, influence, and leverage. I leaned back in my chair, the dim light of my apartment painting the skyline behind me in golden haze, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and excitement. The discovery confirmed what I had long suspected. My family was a labyrinth, each member a piece of a puzzle I had only begun to decipher. And now, The stakes had risen. This invisible adversary could undo everything I had built if I failed to act. The next days became a blur of observation, deduction, and subtle testing. I attended gatherings, carefully noting interactions, microexpressions, and hidden alliances. Each smile, each glance, each casual remark was cataloged, forming a network map in my mind. Slowly, a picture emerged, a silent hand moving pieces from behind the scenes. This adversary had anticipated the moves I had made against Felicity, subtly undermining her influence, testing loyalty, and observing reactions. The sophistication was staggering. I realized the war had entered a new phase, one where overt moves would only provoke subtle countermaneuvers. My strategy needed to evolve from reactive to preemptive, from observation to orchestration. Eleanor's lessons echoed with urgency. See what is hidden, anticipate, and act before the storm strikes. I decided the next step required confrontation, disguised as casual interaction. I invited Felicity to lunch under the pretense of reconciliation. She arrived confident, unaware that I had mapped her network, her movements, and the subtle allies she relied upon. Every word I spoke, every gesture I made was calibrated to expose weaknesses, provoke inadvertent reveals, and consolidate my understanding of the hidden adversary. By observing her reactions and subtle glances toward other family members, I began to piece together alliances that had eluded me. The thrill of uncovering strategy in real time, guiding outcomes without overt action, sent adrenaline through my veins. This was the power Eleanor had envisioned for me, and I was finally beginning to wield it fully. Later, I focused on Marlowe, whose desperation had escalated since the anonymous warnings. He made overt attempts to regain influence, publicly questioning decisions and alliances I had carefully curated. I countered with calm authority, subtle persuasion of mutual contacts, and measured displays of competence. Watching him stumble, unaware that he was being maneuvered into positions of vulnerability, was exhilarating. Each failure, each lapse in judgment, reinforced my growing understanding of power, perception, and influence. The invisible adversary's hand became more apparent. Whoever orchestrated these moves had studied my family as meticulously as I had studied them, testing reactions, calculating outcomes, and leaving just enough ambiguity to create tension and uncertainty. The following week, I orchestrated a private meeting with my parents, framed as a discussion about estate planning. Their guarded expressions and subtle tension told me everything I needed to know. Claudia attempted guilt, Thomas tried intimidation, and distant relatives injected veiled warnings, all under the guise of concern. I maintained calm composure, cataloging reactions, noting alliances, and testing for hidden cues. Each response was data, each gesture a clue. Slowly, I began to see fractures, hidden rivalries, unspoken resentments, and unanticipated loyalties. The deeper I delved, the clearer it became. This invisible adversary was exploiting every microfracture, every hidden ambition, and every lapse in judgment to destabilize my influence. The complexity was daunting, but exhilarating. I realized that victory required not only strategy, but psychological mastery and precise orchestration. One evening, while reviewing old letters and photographs from Eleanor, I discovered annotations that suggested she had anticipated precisely this type of covert opposition. Hidden instructions, subtle guidance, and carefully worded advice outline methods for identifying invisible adversaries, preempting sabotage, and reclaiming control without overt confrontation. Reading her words felt like a hand guiding me from beyond the grave. Eleanor's foresight became my roadmap. Patience, observation, subtle manipulation, and decisive action. Each lesson I applied reinforced my growing power and understanding, confirming that I had the tools to outmaneuver even the most sophisticated threats. The adrenaline surged as I realized that the next move could redefine the balance of power in my family. I began implementing a multi-layered strategy designed to destabilize the hidden adversary without exposing myself. Invitations, conversations, social events, and professional interactions became tools. Subtle misinformation, carefully timed remarks, and controlled demonstrations of influence began to unravel the carefully orchestrated network I had uncovered. Each move was calculated to provoke responses that would reveal more about the hidden enemy's identity and methods. The thrill of executing such a complex plan, watching reactions unfold, and maintaining composure was intoxicating. Eleanor's principles of indirect power, patience, and psychological strategy guided every action. I was no longer reacting. I was orchestrating the battlefield. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Felicity, previously confident and influential, began to falter, her allies questioning her judgment. Marlowe's arrogance became more reckless, exposing him to subtle undermining. Claudia's attempts at guilt and influence became increasingly desperate. Each failure, each misstep, confirmed that the invisible hand guiding these moves had underestimated me. I observed, cataloged, and leveraged each error, tightening control while remaining invisible, untouchable. The strategy was working, but the anonymous warnings reminded me that the ultimate adversary had not yet revealed themselves. Their next move would be critical, sophisticated, and potentially devastating. One night, a subtle breakthrough occurred. While reviewing financial data, I noticed discrepancies suggesting a new, previously unseen participant in the covert network. The transactions were deliberate, coordinated, and almost imperceptible. I traced patterns, cross-referenced with social interactions, and identified anomalies that suggested the hidden adversary was closer than I had imagined. Perhaps someone I had considered loyal, someone who had carefully cultivated trust while manipulating outcomes. My pulse quickened. The stakes had risen, and the hidden player's sophistication was undeniable. I realized that to reclaim absolute control, I would need to confront not just visible threats, but this unseen strategist, navigating a web of deception that could unravel everything. The following day, I tested loyalty within the family subtly. Casual remarks, veiled suggestions, and controlled disclosures were strategically placed to observe reactions. Each glance, hesitation, or shift in tone revealed alignment, fear, or ambition. Slowly, the hidden adversary's network began to emerge from shadows, connections becoming apparent, motives clearer, alliances exposed. The thrill of this discovery was unlike anything I had felt before, a mix of fear, exhilaration, and power. Eleanor's teachings guided me. Act decisively, anticipate, and remain unseen while shaping outcomes. Each day, each move, brought me closer to confronting the hidden strategist and asserting full control. Late one evening, a new letter arrived, unmarked and signed, the words simple but chilling, "You are closer than you think. The game is far from over. Watch every hand, every word, every shadow." I held it in my hands, pulse racing, knowing this was confirmation of the hidden adversary's sophistication. They were not acting impulsively. They were orchestrating, testing, observing, and preparing for a critical strike. The thrill and terror intertwined, a reminder that intelligence, patience, and perception were my only defenses. I sat back, mind racing, already mapping strategies, contingencies, and moves to uncover and neutralize the invisible force threatening everything I had achieved. The night stretched on, filled with calculation, reflection, and planning. I reviewed every interaction, every financial move, every social event, cataloging clues and testing assumptions. Slowly, I began to see patterns, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities within the invisible adversary's network. The thrill of understanding, the anticipation of action, and the intoxicating power of foresight consumed me. Eleanor's guidance had prepared me, but the execution now required complete focus, discipline, and subtlety. The war had reached a new level of complexity, and I knew that the next decisive moves would determine not only dominance, but survival. And just as the first light of dawn crept across the skyline, I realized something terrifyingly clear. The hidden adversary was not just a player. They were someone I had trusted, someone whose influence had shaped family decisions for years. The revelation sent a shiver through me. Every victory, every strategy, every observation had led me to this point. The ultimate confrontation was inevitable, and the outcome would determine not only power but legacy, loyalty, and the fragile balance of influence that had defined my life. The game was far from over. The first realization hit me like a thunderclap. The hidden adversary, the one who had been orchestrating chaos from the shadows, was not a distant cousin or a forgotten relative. They were someone I had trusted implicitly, someone whose presence had always felt like safety. My own Aunt Josephine. The revelation left me momentarily paralyzed, my mind racing through every interaction, every gesture, every seemingly innocent conversation. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. The subtle misdirections, the quiet undermining of felicity, the veiled warnings, the careful orchestration of doubt and fear. Josephine had been manipulating events for years, her influence subtle but devastating. My pulse raced as I realized the depth of her planning, the intelligence behind every move. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. Watch the shadows closest to you. Trust is the most dangerous weapon. I knew that confronting her required strategy, patience, and precision. Rash action would be fatal. I began the next phase with careful observation. Every move Josephine made, every smile, every glance, every subtle manipulation became data points. I cataloged her interactions with family members, monitored her communications, and traced her financial maneuvers with meticulous attention. Slowly, patterns emerged, revealing not only her ambitions, but also vulnerabilities she assumed were hidden. The thrill of anticipation surged through me, knowing that the game had finally reached its apex. This was the ultimate test, her cunning against my foresight, patience, and strategic skill. I felt Eleanor's presence guiding me. Patience, observation, subtlety, and decisiveness would determine victory. My plan had to be flawless. The stakes were higher than ever. One misstep, one sign of doubt, one underestimation, and Josephine could dismantle everything I had built. The first confrontation came disguised as a family brunch. I invited Josephine personally, careful to appear casual and cordial, masking my heightened awareness. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, was cataloged and analyzed in real time. I tested her subtly, planting small pieces of misinformation, observing her reactions, and noting which alliances she relied upon. The thrill of this intellectual dance, the slow, deliberate probing of weaknesses, the anticipation of reactions, was intoxicating. Josephine, confident and composed, did not realize she was being subtly herded into positions of vulnerability. Each measured word, each controlled smile, each calculated acknowledgement allowed me to manipulate perception and gather intelligence. Eleanor's lessons on power, strategy, and subtlety were alive in every move I made, guiding me toward the ultimate confrontation. Meanwhile, the rest of the family remained oblivious, caught in the unfolding web of influence. Marlowe's desperation intensified, Felicity's credibility was crumbling, and Claudia's manipulations had lost their edge. Each failed attempt at control reinforced my dominance while providing opportunities to destabilize Josephine's network further. I orchestrated subtle disruptions, leveraging information, perception, and strategic timing to isolate her influence and force her into miscalculations. By remaining unseen, calm, and authoritative, I maintained control over the battlefield, allowing her own arrogance and assumptions to work against her. Every victory strengthened my position. Every observation sharpened my awareness, and every subtle maneuver edged me closer to exposing the ultimate threat. One afternoon, I orchestrated a subtle trap. I allowed Josephine to believe she had manipulated a mutual family contact into taking a specific action. In reality, I had planted information that reversed the outcome, creating confusion and forcing her to overreach. The elegance of indirect strategy, of letting the opponent act while I remained invisible, was exhilarating. I watched as she faltered subtly, adjusting her moves, unaware that every action had been anticipated and countered. The thrill of intellectual dominance, of manipulating the chessboard without revealing my hand, was intoxicating. Eleanor's teachings on patience, observation, and strategic deception were being applied in full, every move reinforcing my growing authority and psychological mastery. By the evening, cracks in Josephine's network were evident. Allies began questioning her judgment. Subtle errors exposed by my orchestrations eroded trust, and her influence over family decisions began to wane. Each ripple confirmed the precision of my strategy, yet I remained cautious, fully aware that her intelligence, patience, and subtlety could still present surprises. I prepared contingencies, orchestrated alternative moves, and reinforced my alliances to ensure that the next confrontation would be decisive. The thrill of preparing a grand strategic move, while remaining unseen and in control, was exhilarating. The invisible war was nearing its climax, and I felt the weight of anticipation pressing with every heartbeat. The following week, I arranged a private meeting with Josephine, ostensibly to discuss family business matters. Every detail was calculated: location, timing, tone, and subject matter. She arrived composed, confident, unaware that she was stepping into the final phase of my orchestration. I guided the conversation, subtly planting observations, asking indirect questions, and observing her reactions. Slowly, carefully, I forced her to reveal her alliances, motivations, and vulnerabilities. Each admission, each subtle slip, confirmed what I had suspected and provided the foundation for the final stage of my plan. Eleanor's guidance echoed in every choice: act with precision, patience, and invisibility, and victory will follow. By nightfall, I had gathered enough evidence to confront Josephine fully. I laid out the subtle manipulations, exposed alliances, and demonstrated my awareness of her strategies without revealing the full extent of my control. Her composure faltered slightly, revealing the first hint of panic, the first crack in the armor of confidence. I felt a surge of satisfaction, not cruel, but justified. She had orchestrated chaos for years, believing herself untouchable, and now the tables had turned. Eleanor's principles had guided me to this moment, and the thrill of mastering the battlefield of family dynamics was unparalleled. I knew that the final confrontation would cement my authority permanently. The next morning, I coordinated the exposure of Josephine's manipulations to the wider family. Carefully curated evidence, subtle revelations, and strategically timed disclosures dismantled her credibility quietly but decisively. Allies began questioning her judgment. Family members reevaluated their loyalties, and the subtle tension in every interaction became palpable. Josephine, aware of the unraveling but unable to reverse it, attempted feeble defenses, which only accelerated the collapse of her influence. Watching the dominoes fall, each subtle maneuver validated, each reaction anticipated, I felt a combination of relief, exhilaration, and vindication. Eleanor's lessons on patient, strategic revenge had been realized in full, confirming that power wielded with intelligence and subtlety was unstoppable. By the week's end, the family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Marlowe's pride had been tempered, Felicity's influence was gone, and Claudia's attempts at control were neutralized. Josephine's network lay exposed, alliances fractured, and subtle dominance had passed fully into my hands. The thrill of control was tempered by reflection. Influence, patience, and intelligence were more intoxicating than wealth alone. Yet I sensed a final, hidden layer, an even deeper truth, or adversary perhaps still unnoticed. Eleanor's words reminded me victory was not merely in exposure or influence, but in maintaining foresight, vigilance, and the quiet orchestration of power. Late one night, after consolidating my victories, I received one final letter. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, and chillingly precise. Harper, you have done well, but the game is not yet finished. What you have learned will be tested. Prepare, for the final move will define not just power, but legacy, loyalty, and truth. My pulse raced. The message confirmed that even with visible adversaries neutralized, the ultimate revelation, the final test, awaited. The adrenaline surged, but so did clarity. Every lesson, every observation, every strategic move had prepared me for this moment. The final twist was coming, and I was ready. The morning sunlight spilled across my apartment, illuminating the city skyline like a stage set for the final act. Today was the day I would confront the truth, face the ultimate twist, and finalize the game of power and revenge that had consumed my life. I felt Eleanor's presence guiding me, reminding me that patience, subtlety, and observation were my greatest weapons. Every conversation, every financial move, every manipulation over the past months had led to this moment. Josephine's arrogance had blinded her to my awareness. Felicity's desperation had left her vulnerable, and Marlowe's recklessness had made him predictable. Now, I had all the pieces in place. I moved with deliberate calm, mentally rehearsing each word, each pause, each calculated gesture. The storm of revelations, manipulation, and carefully orchestrated vengeance was about to reach its apex, and nothing would be the same afterward. I arrived at the family estate, its halls echoing with decades of memories, whispered betrayals, and hidden ambitions. Every step I took, every door I opened, reminded me of the lessons Eleanor had embedded in my mind. Trust no one blindly, observe everything, anticipate every reaction. Josephine was waiting, confident, and composed, unaware that the final moves had already been set. Her eyes flickered briefly with recognition of tension, a subtle sign of unease, but she had no idea how completely I had dismantled her influence. As I approached, the room seemed suspended in anticipation, the air thick with unspoken emotions, pride, fear, resentment, and unacknowledged guilt. I took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of months of strategy and preparation crystallize into one decisive moment. I began with calm, controlled words, outlining the subtle manipulations, hidden alliances, and invisible moves I had observed. Josephine's expression shifted imperceptibly at first, then more obviously a faint flicker of panic, disbelief, and then fear. The beauty of strategy lay in letting the adversary expose themselves, revealing the truth without confrontation, allowing them to unravel while maintaining authority. As I detailed subtle sabotages and orchestrated moves, she tried to deflect, to rationalize, but each argument was quietly dismantled with evidence, observation, and precision. I could see the cracks widen, her confidence eroding with each carefully chosen revelation. The thrill of intellectual dominance coursed through me, tempered by a sense of justice, of finally leveling the scales that had long been tipped against me. Meanwhile, the rest of the family watched in stunned silence. Marlowe's jaw tightened, Felicity's eyes widened with shock, and Claudia's attempts at intervention failed, as the web of manipulations became visible to all. Every subtle betrayal, every hidden ambition, Every quiet deception was now fully exposed, leaving the perpetrators defenseless. I realized in that moment that revenge was not simply about anger. It was about clarity, influence, and the reclamation of dignity stolen by envy and betrayal. Each calculated step had built toward this crescendo, and the emotional weight of the revelations hung heavy in the room. The atmosphere was electric, tense, and charged with the satisfaction of truth finally surfacing. Josephine's facade crumbled entirely when I revealed the final evidence: financial records, correspondence, and orchestrated interactions she had assumed were invisible. Her face, once composed and confident, now reflected panic, humiliation, and rage. She attempted one last manipulation, trying to shift blame and invoke sympathy, but every word, every tactic had been anticipated. I watched calmly, the culmination of strategy, observation, and subtlety ensuring her failure. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming mix of vindication and sorrow. This was a woman I had once trusted, now fully revealed as the architect of chaos. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly, and the family hierarchy, once fractured and manipulated, had been restored under my authority. As Josephine's influence collapsed, the subtle ripple effects became apparent. Felicity, freed from her rival's shadow, regained some confidence, yet realized the futility of her own schemes. Marlowe, humbled, could no longer act impulsively, his arrogance tempered by failure. Claudia's manipulations were neutralized quietly, her attempts to regain control insufficient against the overwhelming evidence and orchestrated precision. The family dynamic, once chaotic and fractured, was now balanced, but under my careful, invisible control. I felt a mixture of satisfaction, melancholy, and exhilaration, knowing that power had been reclaimed through strategy, subtlety, and patience, not recklessness or force. Eleanor's lessons had guided every move, proving that wisdom and foresight were the true weapons of influence. The final confrontation with Josephine was merciful in its decisiveness. I allowed her a final chance to acknowledge her manipulations, to offer explanations, but her attempts fell flat, dismantled by the clarity of evidence and the calm authority I projected. Her silence spoke volumes, a surrender without words, a recognition that the game had been won. I realized that true revenge was not cruelty. It was revelation, mastery, and the restoration of balance. Each family member understood now the stakes, the manipulations, and the consequences. I had reclaimed not only control, but clarity, dignity, and the satisfaction of outmaneuvering those who had sought to undermine me. The emotional weight of victory settled over me, tempered by reflection and strategy. In the days that followed, I reinforced the restored order. Strategic alliances were quietly maintained, subtle influence ensured compliance, and the family network, once fractured and chaotic, became aligned under my discreet authority. I observed interactions, noting shifts in behavior, loyalty, and alignment, ensuring that the lessons of manipulation, deceit, and ambition had been absorbed. Josephine retreated, her influence permanently weakened, her ambitions curtailed. The subtle power play, orchestrated with patience and intelligence, had achieved its goal: dominance without overt aggression, influence without overt force. The exhilaration of control was profound, but tempered by awareness of the responsibility it demanded. Yet, even as the family dynamics stabilized, a sense of anticipation lingered. Eleanor's letters reminded me that vigilance was never optional. Power, influence, and revenge were fleeting without foresight, observation, and continual adjustment. I spent nights reviewing every interaction, cataloging behavior, and preparing for potential unseen threats. Each victory was tempered by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, might test the boundaries again. The thrill of preparation anticipation, and subtle orchestration became a constant undercurrent in my life, a reminder that mastery of influence required intelligence, patience, and unwavering focus. Eleanor's guidance had made me vigilant, strategic, and unassailable. The final twist came unexpectedly. While reviewing Josephine's remaining correspondence, I discovered a hidden letter from Eleanor addressed to me personally. Its words were simple, elegant, and hauntingly precise. Harper, the gift you have inherited is more than wealth. It is influence, foresight, and responsibility. Use it wisely, and you will shape not just family, but legacy itself. The ultimate test is understanding power, patience, and the quiet strength of observation. I read the words repeatedly, feeling the weight of truth settle upon me. The $3 billion gift, once a source of envy and conflict, was revealed as a tool to cultivate not just dominance, but wisdom, strategy, and the mastery of human behavior. I felt Eleanor's presence beside me, guiding, affirming, and empowering. I took a moment to reflect, the emotional tension of months of conflict finally easing. Every betrayal, every subtle manipulation, every calculated move had been a lesson in strategy, patience, and self-mastery. I realized that revenge was only one aspect. The greater victory was understanding power, influence, and human nature, and using it to reclaim dignity and control. The family, once fractured, now looked to me as the subtle authority, unaware of the full extent of my orchestration. My grandmother's gift had been more than monetary. It was a test, a challenge, and an inheritance of wisdom. And I had passed fully, decisively, and without compromise. As I stood at the estate balcony, looking over the city, I felt a mix of triumph, relief, and anticipation. The battles had ended, the adversaries revealed, and the family dynamic restored, but vigilance remained essential. The lessons of observation, patience, and subtle power would guide me forever. I felt a quiet smile of satisfaction, knowing that I had mastered the game, reclaimed authority, and honored Eleanor's vision. The war was over, but the mastery of influence, strategy, and human dynamics would continue to shape my life, wealth, and legacy. The ultimate twist had been revealed, not destruction, but understanding, strategy, and empowerment. And as the sun set over the skyline, I turned back to the camera, softly smiling, knowing that this story had power beyond family and wealth. It was a lesson in strategy, patience, and human nature. If you've been captivated by Harper's journey, her revenge, and her mastery of influence, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who love dramatic stories, and subscribe for more tales that pull back the curtain on family, power, and secrets. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter of extraordinary drama.